On June 14, 2024, investigators returned to a house in Reynolds Station, Kentucky, a place they had already searched just days earlier after being told that the baby they were looking for had been taken by Child Services, a claim that initially sounded plausible but quickly fell apart once they checked and found no record, no removal, and no explanation for where the child actually was. So they came back, this time more focused, moving carefully through the same rooms, the same clutter, the same environment that had already raised questions, and as they searched again, something stood out, something that didn't fit. Debris that looked disturbed rather than random, placed rather than scattered, and that small detail was enough to stop them and take a closer look. They began clearing it piece by piece, slowly exposing what had been hidden underneath, and what they found was a bag, closed, concealed, and placed in a way that made it clear it wasn't meant to be seen. And when they opened it, they found the body of an already decomposing. And just like that, the case changed, because the child they had been searching for wasn't missing in the way they had first thought. Her name was Miya Rudd, she was 8 months old, and the most important detail was not just how she was found, but where she was found. Because despite everything that had been said, despite the claim that she had been taken, Miya had never left that house. And to understand how that happened, you have to go back to the beginning and to the 8 people who would eventually be arrested in this case. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Miya Rudd was born in October 2023, the 4th child of Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd. And from the outside, her arrival looked like what you would expect in any growing family. Another baby added to a household that already had 3 young children. But inside that home, things were already more complicated than they appeared. She had light brown hair, green eyes, and a calm, expressive face that made people notice her almost immediately. And within the family, she was sometimes called Smiley, because she had that quiet habit of reacting to people with a soft, open expression that made it easy for her siblings to connect with her. By the time she reached 8 months old, Miya was at that stage where things began to change quickly. She could sit up on her own. She was beginning to balance herself without support, and she was close to crawling, which meant she was becoming more aware of her surroundings and more dependent on the environment she was in. And that environment mattered, because even though her early months followed the normal timeline you would expect for a child her age, there was already something in her history that set her apart from the very beginning. Something that authorities noticed almost immediately after she was born. Her umbilical cord tested positive for methamphetamine, and that result changed everything. It meant that from the moment she entered the world, there were already concerns about her safety, concerns about the people responsible for her care, and concerns about the environment she was going to be raised in, so Child Services became involved early, and they began the process of removing her from that home. But that process takes time. It requires steps, documentation, follow-ups, and coordination. And while all of that was happening, Miya remained where she was, still inside that same house, still in the care of the same people, still exposed to the same conditions that had raised concerns in the first place. And that delay, that gap between identifying the risk and actually acting on it, would end up becoming one of the most important details in the entire case. Because by the time anyone came back to complete that process, it was already too late. But to understand what was happening around Miya, you have to look closely at the people inside that house. Because this wasn't just a situation built around 2 parents and their children. It was a wider circle, a group of adults connected by family, by proximity, and in many ways by the same patterns that kept repeating. At the center were her parents, Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd, and by early 2024, both of them already had a history that raised concerns in ways that had already brought them into contact with the legal system, because Cage had previously been charged in connection with illegal substances, and in March 2024, just weeks before Miya was last seen, he was placed on a supervised diversion program instead of serving time, which meant he was still in the community, still in that same environment, but under conditions that required him to stay out of further trouble. But that environment didn't change, and it didn't change because it wasn't just the parents involved. Living around them, and in some cases inside the same property, were other adults. including Mia's grandfather, Ricky Smith, who also had a history of prior offenses, particularly tied to drugs, and whose presence in the home added another layer to what was already a complicated situation, because this was not a household where one person's actions could be separated from another's. Then there was Brodie Payne, an associate who had been staying on the property for months, reportedly living there for around 6 months leading up to the investigation, and his background wasn't neutral either because he had his own involvement in drug-related activity, including prior trafficking charges, and his presence tied the household even more closely to an ongoing pattern that law enforcement was already beginning to notice. So what you had, by early 2024, was not just a family home, but a space where multiple adults with overlapping histories were living in close proximity. And that matters, because it explains why this house was already on the radar before Miya was ever reported missing. But it also explains something else, because this wasn't the first time concerns had been raised about the children in that home. Mia's 3 older siblings had already been removed at different times due to the conditions they were living in, which meant authorities had already seen enough to intervene before, and that history created a pattern that should have been impossible to ignore. But there was already something else happening in the background, because law enforcement had been looking into activity tied to that address for a different reason entirely. And it started with packages, shipments moving through the United States Postal Service, flagged because of what was being sent. So the house in Reynolds Station became part of a broader investigation, one that focused on drug trafficking. And as that investigation developed, officers began to narrow in on the people involved, the property they were using, and the way the operation was being run, which meant that long before Miya was reported missing, that location had already drawn attention. And when officers eventually entered that house, what they found confirmed what they had been suspecting. There were drugs in plain view, there was paraphernalia scattered throughout the space, and there was no real separation between where people lived and where substances were being handled. And in the middle of that, there were signs of a child's presence. There was a crib. There were items that belonged to a baby bottle, a pacifier, and nearby, Narcan, all in the same space. By early April 2024, Miya was still being seen by family members, and nothing at that point suggested that she would suddenly disappear. And then, without any clear moment anyone could point to, that visibility stopped. There was no confirmed sighting after late April, and no one outside that immediate household could say they had seen her again. But instead of that absence being treated as urgent, it was explained away, and the explanation that started to circulate within the family was simple, direct, and just believable enough to delay suspicion. They said child services had taken her. They said CPS had already come in and removed the baby from the home. And for some people, that explanation made sense, because there was already a history of involvement with child services. There were already concerns about the other children, and there had already been talk about removal, so when that story was repeated, it fit into what people thought was already happening. Mia's grandmother accepted it, or at least didn't challenge it immediately. Other relatives heard the same thing and didn't push further. And for a short period of time, that explanation held. But it didn't hold for everyone, because one person started to question it. Mia's aunt, Alexis, heard the same story, but something about it didn't sit right with her, and instead of accepting it at face value, she began asking questions. And then, she did what no one else had done yet. She reached out to authorities, and that decision changed the direction of the entire case. So, officers carried out the welfare check on June 6, 2024, and the parents, Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd, told them the same thing that had already been circulating within the family. They said child services had taken her. But that story didn't stay consistent for long. Because law enforcement didn't rely on statements alone, they verified them. And when they checked with child services, they found something that changed the entire direction of the case. There was no record of Miya being taken, no removal, no documentation, and nothing to support what the parents had just said, and that was the first major red flag. So officers turned their attention to the home itself, and as they began looking more closely, they found exactly what had already been suspected. There were drugs present. So alongside the missing child, there were now clear violations taking place inside the home, and that led to immediate action. Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd were taken into custody. Not yet for anything related to Mia's death, because at that point, investigators still didn't know what had happened to her, but for what they could confirm in that moment, which included drug possession and child abandonment. And just like that, the situation escalated again, because what began as a check on a child had now resulted in arrests and those arrests were only the beginning. Once Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd were taken into custody, the investigation didn't slow down. Mia's grandfather, Ricky Smith, was arrested as part of that expansion. At the same time, Brodie Payne was already in custody from an earlier drug-related case tied to the same property, which meant that even before Miya was officially reported missing, law enforcement had already been moving toward this group from a different angle, and now those two investigations were colliding. And it didn't stop there. Additional arrests followed, including other family members and individuals connected to the property, among them a man identified as Timothy Roach, who was taken into custody during the course of the investigation. And as more people were brought in, the situation began to look less like a single incident and more like a network, a group of individuals connected by location, by activity, and by their proximity to a missing child. But even as the number of arrests increased, one thing didn't change. No one was providing a clear answer. And at that point, police didn't even know if she was alive. So the search expanded beyond the house. Officers moved into the surrounding woods, covering areas behind and around the property, and then they extended that search further into nearby locations, including a cemetery not far from the home. Because in cases like this, when there is uncertainty and no confirmed timeline, investigators have to consider every possibility, and that means looking in places where something could have been hidden or discarded. And it wasn't just a basic search. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect the presence of human remains, and those dogs were deployed across multiple areas, moving through terrain that was difficult to cover thoroughly without assistance. But even with those resources, nothing definitive was found in those initial sweeps. At the same time, law enforcement opened the case to the public. A tip line was released, information was shared, and the community became aware that an 8-month-old baby had not been seen in weeks, and that awareness changed the atmosphere around the investigation because people who had not paid attention before now understood what was at stake. Neighbors, volunteers, and people from nearby areas began to follow the case closely, and some even joined search efforts, because regardless of their opinions about the family or the situation, the focus shifted entirely to the child, and the question everyone was asking was the same: where is Miya? But inside the investigation, the possibilities were becoming more defined, and not in a way that gave comfort. Officers were working through several theories at the same time. One possibility was that someone had taken the child and was keeping her hidden, either within the extended family or somewhere else entirely, which would explain the lack of visibility, but still leave open the chance that she could be found. Another possibility was more complex, that the child had been handed off, possibly in exchange for something, which investigators had to consider given the drug activity tied to the home. And then there was the third possibility, the one that grew harder to ignore as time passed: that Miya was no longer alive. At one point, an officer explained it in simple terms, saying that there was no evidence to show that Miya was alive, but at the same time, there was nothing definitive to confirm that she was dead either, and that uncertainty kept the investigation suspended between hope and reality, forcing officers to continue searching in every direction without knowing which one would lead them to the truth. So the search continued, across the woods, through nearby land, and into spaces where something could have been left behind. But despite all of that effort, despite the resources, the time, and the growing urgency, the answer they were looking for didn't appear in any of those places, because the answer wasn't in the woods. By June 14th, investigators had already spent days searching beyond the house, and that absence of answers brought them back to the one place they had already searched once before: the house. As they moved through the house again, they began paying closer attention to small details, things that might not have stood out during the initial entry, and that's when something caught their attention. An area where debris didn't look random, where items appeared to have been placed rather than simply left there. And that difference, subtle as it was enough to make them stop and take a closer look. So they began clearing it, carefully, piece by piece. And as they did, what had been concealed underneath started to take shape. There was a bag, a duffel bag, positioned in a way that suggested it had been deliberately hidden, and it was clear that whatever was inside that bag was not supposed to be found. And when they opened it, they found the body of an infant. She was inside the bag, wrapped in material, concealed in a way that indicated effort had been made to hide her, and her condition told the rest of the story, because by that point, her body had already begun to decompose, which meant she had been there for some time. And just like that, everything changed. The search was over. The uncertainty that had defined the previous days was replaced by a different kind of reality, one that no longer involved possibilities or theories, but a confirmed outcome that investigators now had to confront. Officers stepped outside. They had to. Because moments like that don't stay contained within the process of an investigation. They affect the people carrying it out, and the realization of what had been found, where it had been found, and how long it had likely been there was something that couldn't be ignored. And with that discovery, the case shifted completely, from a search for a missing child to a full investigation into how and why she ended up there. And in that moment, everything the family had said fell apart. When the remains were transported to the medical examiner, Miya's body was examined, but it was already in an advanced state of decomposition, and that immediately limited what could be determined. And that is why the official ruling came back as undetermined. However, the autopsy did not come back empty, because while the cause of death could not be established, toxicology revealed something that connected directly to everything investigators had already seen at the scene. Methamphetamine was present in her system. So even though the autopsy could not say exactly how she died, it reinforced where she had been and what she had been exposed to. And then there was the second, equally important determination. Because even with the cause of death listed as undetermined, the manner of death was classified as homicide. The classification of homicide meant that investigators believed her death was not accidental, not natural, but the result of circumstances involving responsibility and human action. After Miya's body was discovered on June 14, 2024, the case shifted immediately from a missing child investigation into a criminal case. Law enforcement had already taken initial action against the people inside the home because during the welfare check, when Miya could not be located and drugs were found in plain view, her parents, Tesla Tucker and Cage Rudd, were arrested and charged with drug possession and child abandonment. At the same time, Miya's grandfather, Ricky Smith, was also taken into custody on multiple charges related to drug trafficking, CA, and possession of a firearm as a convicted felon. And another individual connected to the property, Brodie Payne, had already been arrested earlier in connection with a separate drug investigation tied to the same location. But those initial charges were only the beginning. Because once Miya was found inside the home on June 14th, the legal focus expanded, and those charges included abuse of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, failure to report a death, wanton endangerment, and criminal abuse of a child. And within less than a week, on June 20th, 2024, an Ohio County grand jury formally indicted Tesla Tucker, Cage Rudd, Ricky Smith, and Brodie Payne, bringing together all four individuals under a single legal case.
Tucker, Ed Rudd, and baby Miya's grandfather are all facing several charges, including drug trafficking and abuse of a corpse. Eyewitness News' Sydney Davis has more.
And the indictment itself was extensive because it did not focus on a single offense. It outlined a pattern of behavior that prosecutors believed had been taking place inside that home. The charges included engaging in organized crime, criminal abuse of a child, enhanced trafficking of methamphetamine, trafficking of marijuana, enhanced drug possession, wanton endangerment, abuse of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and failure to report a death. And in addition to those charges, Cage Rudd, Ricky Smith, and Brodie Payne were also indicted on multiple counts related to firearm possession due to prior felony convictions, while Tesla Tucker faced all of the same charges except for the firearm counts. At that stage, however, the case had not yet reached its most serious level. Then, in early 2025, after further investigation and review of the evidence, the case escalated again. All four defendants, Tesla Tucker, Cage Rudd, Ricky Smith, and Brodie Payne, were formally charged with murder, and those charges were not based on a single identified cause of death, because the autopsy had ruled the cause as undetermined, but instead on the broader circumstances surrounding Miya's life and death. Prosecutors argued that the child had been placed in a dangerous environment, that she had been exposed to drugs, that the adults responsible for her had failed to protect her, and that after her death, actions were taken to conceal what had happened instead of reporting it, and that combination of factors formed the basis for the murder charges. In February 2025, all four defendants appeared in court for arraignment, and each of them entered a plea of not guilty, which meant the case would proceed to the next phase of the legal process, and those proceedings were conducted virtually, with additional court dates scheduled to allow both the prosecution and the defense to prepare. Then, in March 2025, during a pretrial conference, it was confirmed that investigators had uncovered significant additional evidence, although the details of that evidence were not made public, and because of that, the court granted further time for review, pushing the case forward into additional hearings scheduled for April 2025, with separate dates set for Brodie Payne. And by that point, the legal framework of the case had become clear. This was not a case built on a single moment or a single action. It was a case built on a pattern of drug activity inside the home, a pattern of unsafe conditions, a pattern of failing to act when a child was at risk, and a pattern of concealment after that child had died. Because even without a confirmed cause of death, the prosecution's position was that what happened inside that house and what was done afterward was enough to establish responsibility. And that is what the court would ultimately have to decide in the days and months to come. And hopefully, if Miya's law is signed, countless children would be saved from same pattern of death. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.